My daughter-in-law handed me an envelope after the family dinner. Since you're too stupid to notice, here are the photos of me sleeping with your husband. I had been waiting for this moment. I simply showed her my phone. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The envelope landed on the dining table with a soft thud right between the mashed potatoes and the green bean casserole. Sunday dinner at our house had always been sacred. The whole family gathered around the mahogany table that George and I had bought 40 years ago when we first moved into this house. But tonight, something felt different, electric, dangerous. Linda sat across from me, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her wine glass. She'd been unusually quiet during dinner, which should have been my first warning. My daughter-in-law was never quiet. She always had something to say, some comment about the house, the food, or how things should be done differently. But tonight, she just sat there with that strange little smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "What's this?" I asked, looking down at the manila envelope that had suddenly appeared beside my plate. "Open it," Linda said, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Cold, calculating. "Since you're too stupid to notice what's happening in your own house." My son Michael looked up from his plate, confusion creasing his brow. "Linda, what are you doing?" George shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fork clattering against his plate. I watched him from the corner of my eye, noting how his face had gone pale, how his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "Go ahead, Maggie." Linda continued, leaning back in her chair, like she was settling in to watch a show. "Open it. See what your precious husband has been up to while you've been playing the perfect little housewife." The words hit me like ice water, but I kept my expression neutral. Curious even. Inside, though, my heart was racing not from shock, but from anticipation. I'd been waiting for this moment for 4 months. 4 long months of pretending I didn't know. 4 months of smiling at family dinners while my husband and daughter-in-law thought they were so clever. With steady hands, I lifted the envelope's flap and slid out the contents. Photographs, 8 by 10 glossy prints that captured everything in vivid detail. George and Linda in our guest bedroom. George and Linda in what looked like a hotel room. George and Linda kissing passionately in his car. I let out a small gasp, covering my mouth with my free hand. "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice breaking just the right amount. "George, how could you?" Michael's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he stood up abruptly. "What the hell is going on here?" George finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the table. I saw guilt there. Yes, but also fear. Good. He should be afraid. "Maggie, I can explain." He started, but Linda cut him off with a laugh. "What's to explain?" she said, taking a sip of wine like she didn't have a care in the world. "Your father and I are in love, have been for months, and frankly, it's time everyone knew." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at his wife like he'd never seen her before. George looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. And me? I sat there, photographs scattered in front of me, playing the role of the devastated wife to perfection. "I don't understand," Michael said, his voice hollow. "Linda, you're my wife." "Dad, she's your daughter-in-law. This is sick." Linda shrugged, completely unmoved by her husband's pain. "These things happen, Michael. Your father makes me feel alive in ways you never could." I watched my son's face crumble, saw the exact moment his heart broke, and felt a familiar rage building in my chest. But I pushed it down. Not yet. I had to wait for the perfect moment. How long, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 7 months, Linda said with obvious satisfaction. Maybe longer. Time has a way of blurring when you're truly happy. 7 months. She was lying. Of course, I knew it had been closer to 9 months because I'd been tracking their affair almost from the beginning. George had never been good at hiding things. The unexplained absences, the new cologne, the way he started working out again at 66. And Linda? Well, she thought she was so much smarter than everyone else. I think I'm going to be sick, I said, standing up slowly. I need some air. Mom! Michael started reaching for me, but I waved him away. Just give me a minute, I said, walking toward the kitchen on unsteady legs. I need to process this. But instead of going outside, I stopped just around the corner, where I could still hear everything, but they couldn't see me. This was when people revealed their true selves, when they thought the wounded party was out of earshot. You didn't have to be so cruel, I heard Michael say, his voice thick with emotion. Oh, please, Linda replied. Your mother needed to know. She's been walking around here for months playing happy families while her husband was falling in love with someone else. I did her a favor. A favor? Michael's voice cracked. You destroyed my parents' marriage. You destroyed our marriage. Your parents' marriage was already dead, Linda said dismissively. And as for ours, well, that was never real to begin with. I heard George clear his throat. Linda, maybe we should. Should what? She snapped. Pretend this never happened. George, we agreed. It's time to stop hiding. I'm tired of sneaking around like some common. You are a common, Michael said, and I felt a flash of pride at my son's words. Careful Linda's voice turned dangerous. You might want to think about how you speak to me. After all, I have more photos, some that might be very interesting to your business partners. George told me all about those questionable deals you've been making. My blood ran cold. She was threatening my son now. That changed everything. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the folder I'd labeled insurance. 4 months of investigation, 4 months of patience, and finally, it was time to use what I'd learned. Taking a deep breath, I walked back into the dining room. All 3 of them looked up as I entered, Linda still wearing that smug smile. You know what, Linda? I said, my voice steady now. You're absolutely right. I have been too stupid to notice what was happening in my own house. Her smile widened. Finally, some honesty. Yes, I agreed, pulling out my phone. Finally, I turned the screen toward her. Is this honest enough for you? Linda's face went white as she stared at the phone. On the screen was a photograph, not one of George and her, but one of her, with a man I'd never seen before. A man who definitely wasn't my husband. They were in what looked like the same hotel room from her photos, but this picture was taken just 2 weeks ago. What is... She started, but her voice died in her throat. His name is Robert, I said calmly. Robert Ellis. Ring any bells? Linda's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Red wine spread across the white oak like blood. That's impossible, she whispered. Is it? I asked, scrolling to the next photo. Because according to my research, Robert Ellis is your husband. Your real husband, the one you married in Arizona 3 years ago, the one you told everyone was dead. And then, like a house of cards collapsing, Linda's carefully constructed world began to fall apart. Her eyes rolled back, her body swayed, and she crumpled to the floor in a dead faint. As I looked down at her unconscious form, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Satisfaction. The game was just beginning. 4 months earlier, I had been folding laundry in the master bedroom when I heard George's phone buzz on the nightstand. He was in the shower, and normally I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But something made me glance over, and what I saw on the lock screen made my blood freeze. Can't wait to feel you inside me again. L. 45. Years of marriage. And this was how I discovered my husband was cheating. Not through some dramatic confrontation or suspicious behavior I'd been tracking for 4 months. Just a simple text message that appeared at exactly the wrong moment. My hands shook as I set down the towel I'd been folding. L. There was only one person in our lives with that initial who would send such a message. Linda, my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd been sitting at my dinner table for the past 2 years eating my food, accepting my kindness, all while planning to destroy my family. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? How many family gatherings had I hosted while they exchanged secret glances? How many times had I welcomed her into my home while she was sleeping with my husband? The shower was still running. George's phone buzzed again. George forgot his phone. I called out, my voice surprisingly steady. I'll just leave it here. But instead of leaving it, I picked it up. George had never been particularly tech-savvy. His password was still our anniversary date, just like it had been for years. My fingers trembled as I entered the numbers. 06121980. The phone unlocked. What I found in his messages made me physically ill. Months of correspondence. Intimate photos, detailed plans for secret meetings, and worse conversations about me, about how I was getting old and letting myself go, about how I was boring and predictable. But it was the most recent conversation that really caught my attention. Linda had sent a screenshot of what looked like a marriage certificate, but something about it seemed wrong. The quality was poor, pixelated, and when I zoomed in, I could see subtle inconsistencies in the font. That's weird, I whispered to myself, screenshotting the image before George finished his shower. The next morning, while George was at his golf game and Michael was at work, I found myself alone with Linda for the first time since discovering the affair. She'd come over to drop off some books she'd borrowed, and I watched her carefully as she moved through my kitchen like she owned it. Coffee I offered, keeping my voice light and friendly. Sure, she said, not even looking at me as she scrolled through her phone. Make it strong. I barely slept last night. I'll bet you didn't, I thought, but smiled sweetly instead. Oh, everything okay? She glanced up then, and for just a moment I caught something in her expression. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. Just thinking about things, she said vaguely. You know how it is? No, I didn't know how it was. I didn't know how it felt to betray someone who'd welcomed me into their family. But I nodded anyway. Linda, I said, carefully handing her the coffee. I was looking at family photos the other day, and I realized we don't have any pictures from your first wedding to Robert. The coffee mug slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor and sending ceramic shards and hot liquid everywhere. She said, jumping back, Sorry I'm so clumsy today, but I'd seen her face in that split second before the mug fell. Terror. Pure, undiluted terror. Don't worry about it, I said, grabbing paper towels. These things happen. But about those photos, Robert died in a car accident, she said, quickly crouching down to help clean up the mess. It's too painful to look at pictures of him. Of course, I said, softly. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories, but as we cleaned up the coffee together, I was already planning my next move. Something about Linda's story had never quite added up. She'd appeared in Michael's life suddenly, with very little history. And while I'd attributed that to grief over her deceased husband, now I wondered if there might be another explanation. That afternoon, I did something I never thought I would do. I hired a private investigator. Daniel Brooks came highly recommended, and his office was small but professional. He listened patiently as I explained the situation, taking notes in a small leather notebook. "What exactly are you hoping to find, Mrs. Reynolds?" he asked when I finished. "The truth," I said simply, "about who Linda really is and whether Robert Ellis is really dead." It took Daniel 3 weeks to uncover what he called preliminary findings, but when he called me to his office, his expression was grim. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, sliding a folder across his desk, "I think you need to see this." Inside the folder were photographs, documents, and printouts that painted a picture I never could have imagined. Robert Ellis wasn't dead. He was very much alive and living in Denver, Colorado. He was also, according to the official documents Daniel had obtained, still married to Linda. "She's a bigamist," Daniel explained, pointing to the marriage certificates. "She married your son while still legally married to Mr. Ellis, but that's not the worst part." He flipped to another section of the file revealing bank statements and credit reports. "She's done this before," he continued. "At least twice that I can confirm. She targets older men, usually married men with money, seduces them, and then disappears with whatever she can take. Mr. Ellis lost his house, his savings, even his business because of her." I stared at the evidence in front of me, feeling sick. "She's a con artist, a very good one," Daniel agreed. "She changes her name, her backstory, even her appearance slightly each time, but she always uses variations of the same identity. Emily, Emma Linda, and she always claims to be a widow." "What about George?" I asked. "My husband. Is he just another Mark?" Daniel hesitated. "I think it started that way, but from what I can tell, she's been planning something bigger with your family. She's been collecting information about your son's business, your financial situation, even your property holdings." My hands clenched into fists. She wasn't just destroying my marriage. She was planning to destroy everything we'd built. "There's more," Daniel said quietly. "Mr. Ellis has been looking for her. He wants to press charges for theft and fraud, and the other men she's conned. They're all willing to testify if it comes to that." I looked down at the photographs of Robert Ellis. He was younger than George, maybe in his 50s, with kind eyes and graying temples. In one photo, he was holding a picture of Linda, but she looked different somehow, softer, less calculating. "Can you arrange a meeting?" I asked suddenly. Daniel raised an eyebrow with Mr. Ellis. "Yes, I think he and I need to have a conversation." 2 days later, I found myself in a small coffee shop downtown, waiting for a man I'd never met, but who held the key to exposing my daughter-in-law's true nature. When Robert Ellis walked in, I recognized him immediately from the photographs. But what struck me most was how broken he looked, older than his years, with the kind of weariness that comes from betrayal. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, approaching my table cautiously. "Please call me Maggie," I said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming." As we sat down, I studied his face. There was kindness there, and hurt, but also something else. "Hope, maybe." "I have to ask," he said after we'd ordered coffee. "Is she using the name Linda now?" "Linda Carter Reynolds," I confirmed. "She married my son 2 years ago." Robert's face crumpled. "She's married again." "Of course she is, Mr. Ellis," I said gently. "I need you to tell me everything about Linda, about what she did to you, about who she really is." And so he did. For the next 2 hours, Robert told me about the woman who'd swept into his life 5 years earlier, calling herself Emma, how she'd claimed to be a widow, how she'd been so loving and attentive, how he'd fallen completely under her spell. She took everything he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My savings, my house, my business. She even took my mother's jewelry pieces that had been in my family for generations. And then, one morning, I woke up and she was just gone. "Did you go to the police?" I tried, but she was smart about it. Everything she took, she'd convinced me to give her willingly. Gifts, joint accounts, property transfers. Legally, it was all above board. The police said it was a civil matter. I reached across the table and touched his hand. What if I told you we might be able to stop her together? Robert looked up, and for the first time since he'd walked in, I saw a spark of something other than defeat in his eyes. What did you have in mind? As I explained my plan, I watched hope return to Robert Ellis's face. And for the first time since discovering George's betrayal, I felt something other than hurt and anger. I felt powerful. The morning after my meeting with Robert, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since discovering George's affair, I had a plan not just to expose Linda, but to understand exactly how deep her web of lies went, and more importantly, to figure out George's role in all of this. I found him in the kitchen, reading the newspaper, with his morning coffee, looking for all the world like a man without a care. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. Good. He should be nervous. George, I said, pouring myself coffee with deliberate calm. We need to talk. He looked up, and I caught the flash of panic in his eyes before he masked it with confusion. About what? Dear, about Linda. The newspaper crinkled as his grip tightened. What about her? I sat down across from him, studying his face. How long have you known her real name is Linda Carter? The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. The newspaper fell from his hands, scattering across the kitchen table. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was weak, unconvincing. Her real name is Linda Carter. I continued watching his reaction carefully. Before that, it was Emma Daniels. And her legal name, the one on her marriage certificate to Robert Ellis, is Elizabeth Margaret Sawyer. George's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Maggie, You knew, I said, and it wasn't a question. You knew she was married to someone else, and you knew she was lying about who she was. He buried his face in his hands. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, George looked up, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my husband's eyes. Genuine fear. She's blackmailing me, he whispered. Whatever I'd been expecting him to say, it wasn't that. What? 4 months ago, she came to me with photos. Not of us together, but of me from 22 years ago. His voice was shaking now. The Henderson deal. The Henderson deal. I remembered it vaguely. Some property development George had been involved with when Michael was in college. I'd never paid much attention to George's business dealings, trusting him to handle everything while I focused on raising our son. What about it? I asked, though I was already starting to piece together the answer. There were irregularities, George said, staring down at his hands. Nothing major, just some paperwork that got filed incorrectly, some inspections that were rushed through. Everyone involved knew about it, including the city officials. It was just the way business was done back then. But it wasn't legal. Not technically, no. And if someone were to bring it to light now, with all the new oversight regulations, I could face serious charges. Fraud, bribery, maybe even racketeering if they really wanted to make an example of me. I felt like the floor was shifting beneath my feet. How does Linda know about this? George's laugh was bitter and hollow. She seduced one of the guys who worked on the project, Rick Morrison. He'd kept copies of everything, and when he died last year, she inherited all his files. She knew exactly what she had, so she came to you. She said she'd keep quiet about the Henderson deal if I helped her get close to Michael. She wanted to marry into our family, gain access to our finances, our social circle. She said it would just be temporary, that she'd disappear after a year or two with enough money to start over somewhere else. And you agreed. What choice did I have? George's voice cracked. If those documents came to light, I'd lose everything. The business, our house, our reputation. You and Michael would be destroyed, right along with me. I stared at my husband, this man I'd shared my life with for over 4 decades, and realized I didn't know him at all. So you sacrificed our son's happiness to save yourself. To save all of us, he protested. I thought I could control the situation. I thought I could keep her satisfied with small amounts of money, maybe some jewelry. I never intended for things to go this far. This far meaning sleeping with her. George flinched as if I'd slapped him. That wasn't part of the original plan. She seduced me, Maggie. She made me feel young again. Desirable. I know how pathetic that sounds, but it's the truth. When did you realize she was planning to take more than just a little money? About a month ago, she started asking questions about Michael's business, about our investments, about the value of the house, and she wanted me to convince Michael to make her a partner in his company. That's when I knew I was in over my head. I felt a cold rage building in my chest, and you still said nothing. You were going to let her destroy Michael's life to save your own skin. I was trying to figure out a way to stop her, George said desperately. I swear, Maggie, I was looking for a solution. The only solution you were looking for was in her bed. George broke down, then sobbing like a child. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I watched him cry and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort him. Just a cold, calculating clarity about what needed to happen next. George, I said, my voice steady and calm. You're going to help me stop her. He looked up, wiping his eyes. What? You heard me. You're going to help me expose Linda for what she really is, and you're going to make sure Michael is protected from the fallout. I can't. If she releases those documents, she's not going to release anything. I interrupted, because by the time I'm done with her, she's going to have much bigger problems to worry about. George stared at me like he'd never seen me before. What are you planning? I stood up, dumping my untouched coffee into the sink. What I should have done the moment I found out about your affair. I'm taking control of this situation. Maggie, please. You don't understand how dangerous she is. She's not just a cheating wife or a gold digger. She's a professional con artist. She's destroyed other families, other men. If you cross her, if I cross her, what? I turned to face him, and whatever he saw in my expression made him shrink back. She'll try to destroy me. George, she's already destroyed me. She's taken my husband, manipulated my son, and turned my family into her personal playground. What exactly do I have left to lose? Your freedom, he said quietly. If you do something illegal, I'm not planning to do anything illegal. I'm planning to do something much worse. I'm going to tell the truth. Before George could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Daniel Brooks's number. Mrs. Reynolds, Daniel said when I answered. I have news about Elizabeth Sawyer, and I think you're going to want to hear this in person. An hour later, I sat in Daniel's office while he spread a new collection of documents across his desk. George had begged to come with me, but I'd refused. This was my fight now, and I was going to handle it my way. What did you find? I asked. More victims, Daniel said grimly. A lot more. I've been in contact with law enforcement in 3 states, and it turns out Elizabeth Sawyer has been running the same con for almost 10 years. The pattern is always the same. She targets wealthy, older married men, seduces them, then uses a combination of blackmail and manipulation to gain access to their finances. How many men? At least 8 that we can confirm, possibly more. And the amounts she's stolen are staggering. We're talking about millions of dollars, Mrs. Reynolds. I felt sick. What happened to them? The other men, too, committed suicide, Daniel said quietly. The others lost everything. Their businesses, their homes, their families. She's very good at making sure the legal responsibility falls on her victims rather than herself. But you said law enforcement is involved now. They are. The FBI has been building a case against her for the past year, but she's been careful. Very careful. They need something concrete, something that ties all her different identities together and proves criminal intent. What kind of something? Daniel leaned forward. They need her to confess to someone she trusts, someone she thinks is safe. I understood immediately. You want me to wear a wire? The FBI agents I've been working with think you're in a unique position. You're the one person who knows her true identity, but whom she still sees as a threat to be eliminated rather than an ally to be manipulated. If you could get her to talk about her other cons, her other identities, she'd incriminate herself. Exactly. But Mrs. Reynolds, I have to warn you, this would be extremely dangerous. If she suspects you're working with law enforcement, there's no telling what she might do. I thought about George's words about how dangerous Linda was about the two men who'd committed suicide rather than face the ruin she'd brought to their lives, about my son, who had no idea that his wife was planning to destroy everything he'd worked for. When do we start? I asked. Daniel smiled for the first time since I'd met him. I'll make the call. As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was racing with possibilities. For months, I'd felt powerless watching my family fall apart while pretending everything was normal. But now, for the first time, I had the tools to fight back. Linda thought she was the predator in this situation. She thought she was the one pulling the strings, manipulating everyone around her for her own benefit. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The FBI office in downtown Denver was not what I'd expected. Agent Sarah Chen was younger than me by at least 20 years, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of myself when I was her age, back when I thought I could take on the world. Her partner, Agent Michael Torres, was older with graying temples and the kind of patience that comes from years of dealing with complicated cases. Mrs. Reynolds, Agent Chin said, as she led me into a small conference room. I want you to understand exactly what we're asking you to do, and more importantly, what the risks are. I settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair and folded my hands in my lap. I understand the risks. What I want to know is whether this will actually stop her. Agent Torres slid a thick folder across the table. This is everything we have on Elizabeth Sawyer, also known as Emily Morrison Emma Daniels, and now Linda Carter. She's been running variations of the same con for almost a decade, and we estimate she's stolen close to $3 million from her victims. I opened the folder and found myself looking at photographs of men I'd never seen before. They all had something in common, though. They looked broken, defeated. Some of the photos appeared to be mugshots. Others looked like they were taken at funerals. These are her victims, I asked. The ones we know about, Agent Chin confirmed. Robert Harrison, age 62, lost his construction business and committed suicide 6 months after she disappeared. Michael Chen, no relation to me, lost his savings and his family. He's currently serving time for embezzlement because she convinced him to steal from his own company to fund her lifestyle. I turned the page and found more photos, more stories of destroyed lives. How is she getting away with this? She's extremely careful about how she operates. Agent Torres explained. She never technically steals anything. Instead, she manipulates her victims into giving her money willingly, gifts, investments, joint accounts. And she always makes sure they're complicit in some kind of illegal activity so they can't go to the police without incriminating themselves like she's doing with George. Exactly. She researches her targets thoroughly before making contact. She knows their weaknesses, their secrets, their vulnerabilities, and she exploits all of them. Agent Chen leaned forward. What makes your situation unique, Mrs. Reynolds, is that you discovered her true identity before she completed her con. She's not expecting you to fight back, which gives us an advantage we've never had before. What exactly would I need to do? We'd wire you for sound. Agent, Torres said. Nothing visible, just a small recording device. Then you'd need to get her to talk about her other cons, her other identities. If we can get her to confess to just one of the previous thefts, we can arrest her and start building a case that connects all her crimes. How am I supposed to get her to confess? Agent Chen smiled grimly. You use the same tactic she's been using on everyone else. You manipulate her. Over the next hour, they explained their plan in detail. I would confront Linda about her real identity, but instead of threatening to expose her, I would offer to become her partner. I would claim that I was tired of my boring life as a housewife and wanted in on her next con. The idea was to make her feel safe enough to brag about her previous successes. She's narcissistic, Agent Chen explained. Con artists like her can't resist showing off their cleverness to someone they think appreciates their skill. If you approach her as an admirer rather than an enemy, she'll likely tell you everything. It was risky. If Linda suspected I was working with law enforcement, there was no telling what she might do. But as I looked at the photos of her previous victims, I knew I didn't have a choice. When do we do this? I asked. We need a few days to set up the recording equipment and brief you on exactly what to say, Agent Torres said. In the meantime, you need to act completely normal. Don't let her suspect that anything has changed. Acting normal turned out to be harder than I'd expected. That evening, as I prepared dinner for yet another family gathering, I found myself studying every interaction between Linda and the rest of the family with new eyes. She was good. I had to give her that. She played the role of the loving daughter-in-law, perfectly complimenting my cooking, asking George about his golf game, listening attentively as Michael talked about his work. But now I could see the calculation behind every smile, every laugh, every seemingly innocent question. When she asked Michael about his latest contracts, she wasn't making conversation. She was gathering intelligence. When she complimented George on his new watch, she wasn't being sweet. She was cataloging our assets. Mom, you seem distracted tonight, Michael said during dessert, pulling me from my observations. Just tired, I said, forcing a smile. It's been a long week. Linda looked up from her pie, and for just a moment, I caught something in her expression. Suspicion maybe, or concern that her carefully laid plans might be in jeopardy. You have been working yourself pretty hard lately, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Maybe you should take a vacation. George was just telling me how much you've always wanted to visit Europe. I met her eyes across the table. Were you now George? My husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I may have mentioned it. Oh, how thoughtful of you both to plan my life for me, I said, keeping my tone light, but letting just a hint of steel creep in. But I'm quite happy where I am. Thank you. Linda's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. I just thought it might be nice for you to have some time to yourself to relax, to get me out of the way, she meant. I wondered how many of her previous marks had been encouraged to take convenient vacations at crucial moments in her cons. I'll keep that in mind, I said pleasantly. After dinner, as Linda and Michael prepared to leave, she lingered in the kitchen while Michael said goodbye to George in the living room. Maggie, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Can I ask you something? Of course, dear. Have you noticed anything different about George lately? He seemed stressed. I turned to face her, studying her expression. What kind of different? I don't know. Distracted, worried about something. I'm just concerned about him. You know he's getting older and stress can be so dangerous at his age. She was fishing, trying to figure out how much I knew. Or maybe she was laying the groundwork for her next move. I decided to test her. Now that you mention it, I said slowly. He has been acting strange, more secretive than usual. I found some papers in his office the other day that I didn't recognize. Linda's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of papers? Legal documents of some kind. I didn't read them carefully, but they looked official. I paused, watching her reaction. There was something about property transfers, I think. That's probably nothing, Linda said quickly, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. George handles a lot of business deals. I'm sure it's just routine paperwork. You're probably right, I agreed, although some of the documents looked quite old, like they were from years ago. Linda went very still. How old? I'm not sure. Maybe 20 years. The paper looked yellowed, and the typing was different from what you see now. Huh, Linda said, trying to sound casual but failing completely. That is strange. Michael appeared in the doorway, then saving Linda from having to continue the conversation. Ready to go, huh? Absolutely, she said, her mask of perfect wife sliding back into place. Maggie, thank you for dinner as always. It was delicious. After they left, I found George in his study staring blankly at his computer screen. She's getting nervous, I said, closing the door behind me. George looked up startled. What do you mean, Linda? She was asking about you, about whether you seemed stressed, and she was very interested when I mentioned finding old legal documents. What old legal documents? I made it up, I said impatiently. The point is, she took the bait. She's worried that you might have kept records of the Henderson deal. George paled. If she thinks I have evidence that could incriminate her, she'll accelerate her timeline. I finished, which is exactly what we want. I sat down across from his desk, meeting his eyes directly. George, in 3 days, I'm going to confront Linda about who she really is. And when I do, you're going to back me up. Maggie, you can't. It's too dangerous. It's more dangerous to let her continue. She's not just planning to steal money from our family, George. She's planning to destroy Michael completely, just like she's destroyed all the others. And if we don't stop her, his blood will be on our hands. George was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. What do you need me to do? When the time comes, I need you to tell Michael the truth about the blackmail, about how this whole thing started. He needs to understand that none of this is his fault. And what about us? George asked quietly. Our marriage? I looked at my husband, this man who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, and felt nothing but emptiness where love used to be. I don't know. I said honestly, but our marriage is the least of our problems right now. 2 days later, Agent Chen called to confirm that everything was ready. The recording device was so small it would be virtually undetectable, and they'd identified the perfect location for the confrontation, a small cafe downtown, where they could position surveillance teams without being obvious. Remember, Agent Chen said, as she fitted the tiny microphone to my clothing. The goal is to get her talking about her previous cons. Ask her about the other men, about how she convinced them to give her money. Make her think you're impressed by her skill. What if she doesn't believe that I want to partner with her? Then we abort and find another way, Agent Torres said firmly. Your safety is our top priority, Mrs. Reynolds. If at any point you feel threatened, just say the code word and we'll move in immediately. The code word was butterfly, something I could work into conversation naturally if things went wrong. As I drove to the cafe that afternoon, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. For 3 months, I'd been living a lie, pretending I didn't know about George's affair, pretending I still trusted Linda. Now I was about to drop that pretense and reveal exactly how much I knew. But I wasn't scared. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was taking control of my own life. Linda was already waiting when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a perfect view of the entire cafe. She'd chosen her position carefully. I realized somewhere she could see anyone approaching, somewhere she could run if necessary. She was learning to be cautious, but she was about to learn that she wasn't cautious enough. The cafe was busier than I'd expected for a Tuesday afternoon. Office workers grabbing late lunches, college students hunched over laptops, an elderly couple sharing a piece of cake. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that they were about to witness the takedown of a professional con artist. I spotted Linda immediately. She had chosen a table in the far corner, her back to the wall, wearing dark sunglasses despite being indoors. She looked nervous, which was unusual for her. In all the time I'd known her, I'd never seen Linda anything less than perfectly composed. "Thank you for meeting me," I said as I slid into the seat across from her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Your message was pretty cryptic," she replied, not bothering with pleasantries. "What's this about Maggie?" I ordered coffee from the waitress, taking my time, letting the tension build. Somewhere in this cafe, FBI agents were watching, listening, waiting for me to get Linda to incriminate herself. The tiny recording device felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "It's about Marcus," I said finally. Linda went perfectly still for just a moment. Her carefully maintained mask slipped, and I saw pure terror flash across her face before she recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus Taylor, your husband. Your very much alive husband." Linda's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. "Marcus is dead." "No, he's not. He's living in Phoenix, Arizona, working construction, and he's been looking for you for 3 years. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Elizabeth." The name hit her like a physical blow. She actually flinched, her sunglasses sliding down her nose enough for me to see her eyes. They were the eyes of a cornered animal. "How did you—" she started, then stopped herself. "Find out. It wasn't that hard once I knew what to look for." "You're good, Linda, but you're not perfect. You left traces enough for someone who knew where to look." Linda glanced around the cafe, and I could see her calculating exit routes, assessing threats. "What do you want to talk, really talk? No more lies. No more games."
I know who you are, what you've done, and what you're planning to do to my family. You don't know anything. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photos Daniel had given me. Photos of her other victims, other identities, other cons. I turned the screen toward her. Robert Harrison. Emily Morrison convinced him to embezzle money from his company pension fund. He killed himself rather than face the consequences. I swiped to the next photo. Michael Chen, Emma Daniels got him to liquidate his retirement accounts and his children's college funds. He's currently in prison. With each photo, each name, Linda seemed to shrink further into herself. But I wasn't done. Thomas Wright. Jennifer Daniels. That's a new one, isn't it? Convinced him to mortgage his house to fund her investment opportunities. He lost everything and died of a heart attack 6 months later. "Stop," Linda whispered. "Why?" "Because it's unpleasant to see the results of your work laid out like this."
"Because it's easier to pretend these were just business transactions instead of the systematic destruction of human lives." Linda suddenly straightened, and when she looked at me again, the mask was firmly back in place. "What do you want, Maggie? I want in." Whatever she'd been expecting me to say, it wasn't that. "What I want in on whatever you're planning next. I'm tired of being the beautiful wife, the perfect mother-in-law. I'm tired of watching everyone else live interesting lives while I fold laundry and host dinner parties." Linda stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You're not serious. I'm completely serious. You think I don't know about George's affairs? You think this is the first time my husband has cheated on me?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Honey, I've been looking the other way for 20 years. The only difference is that this time I found someone who might actually be worth my attention." "You're insane, am I?" Look at what you've accomplished. You've taken millions of dollars from men who thought they were smarter than you. You've lived a dozen different lives, been whoever you wanted to be. That's not insane. That's brilliant. I could see her processing this, trying to figure out if I was serious or if this was some kind of trap. Even if I believed you, which I don't, what makes you think I need a partner? Because you're getting sloppy, I said bluntly. The Marcus Taylor thing, for instance. You should have made sure he was actually dead before claiming to be a widow. And this whole business with George and the blackmail that's messy, unnecessarily complicated. Linda's eyes sharpened. How do you know about the blackmail? Please, did you really think George could keep a secret like that? He told me everything. The Henderson deal, your threats, all of it. I leaned back in my chair. But here's what I don't understand. Why go through all that trouble when there are easier ways to get what you want? Such as, George is not the one with the real money in this family. I am. That got her attention. What do you mean? My father left me a trust fund that George doesn't even know about. $3.5 million sitting in an account that only I can access. George thinks we live off his income. But the truth is, I've been subsidizing our lifestyle for years. I was lying. Of course there was no trust fund. But I needed her to believe that I had access to serious money. Money that would make her current con look like pocket change. Why are you telling me this? Because I want out of this life and you're going to help me do it. We take the money and disappear. Start fresh somewhere else. Maybe work together on bigger cons. Think about it. A grieving widow and her helpful friend. Both starting over after tragedy. We could target country clubs, charity organizations, retirement communities, rich old men with more money than sense. For the first time since I'd sat down, Linda looked genuinely interested. You're really serious about this, dead serious. But I need to know I'm partnering with someone who knows what she's doing. Tell me about the others. How did you convince them to give you their money? And just like that, the floodgates opened. Robert was easy, she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone discussing a particularly successful recipe. He was lonely recently, divorced, looking for someone to make him feel young again. I played the struggling widow needing help with my late husband's debts. He was so eager to be my hero. How much did you get from him? $450,000 would have been more, but he started getting suspicious when his accountant asked questions. That's when I knew it was time to disappear. And Michael Chen, he was trickier. Married kids, but he had a gambling problem his wife didn't know about. I convinced him that I had insider information on some investments that we could make enough money to cover his debts and set up his family for life. He was so desperate to believe it was possible. She was warming to the subject now, pride evident in her voice. As she described each con in detail, the recording device was getting everything. Names, amounts, methods enough to connect her to crimes across multiple states. What about Thomas, right? I prompted. Thomas was probably my best work, she said with obvious satisfaction. I spent 6 months gaining his trust, learning about his finances, his family, his weaknesses. He thought he was investing in a real estate development company. Really, the money was just going into offshore accounts I'd set up. How did you get him to trust you with so much money? I started small, a few thousand here and there, always with impressive returns. I made sure he thought he was getting rich. By the time I asked for the big investment, he was so convinced of my brilliance that he mortgaged his house without question. And then you disappeared. And then I became someone else, she corrected. That's the beauty of it, Maggie. When you're done with one life, you just start another. What about Marcus Taylor? How does he fit into all this? Linda's expression darkened. Marcus Taylor was supposed to be different. He was my exit strategy, the man I was going to settle down with when I was ready to retire. But he started asking too many questions, wanting to know about my past, my family. I realized he was getting too close to figuring out who I really was. So you faked your own death. Car accident. I had help from someone who owed me a favor. Falsified police reports. planted evidence. As far as the official record shows, Elizabeth Sawyer died in a lake in Montana 3 years ago. But Marcus Taylor never believed it. "Marcus is an idiot," she said dismissively. "He hired private investigators, posted on social media, even had missing person flyers printed. He made it much harder for me to move on to my next target, which was George, which was your family," she corrected. "George was just the easiest point of entry, but the real prize is David's business. He's built something substantial, and he trusts people too easily. With the right manipulation, I could have convinced him to make me a partner, maybe even leave me the company in his will." "And what about me? What was I supposed to be in all this?" Linda smiled, and it was like looking at a snake. "You were supposed to be the grieving widow. After George's tragic heart attack, of course." The words hit me like ice water. "You were planning to kill George. Not kill, help along. George's blood pressure medication is very easy to replace with something that looks identical but has very different effects. A man his age under that kind of stress. These things happen." My hands clenched into fists under the table. She wasn't just a con artist. She was planning murder. And David would have inherited everything with his loving stepmother there to help him through his grief. It would have taken a few years, but eventually I would have had access to everything your family built. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep playing the role. That's actually brilliant. Thank you. I thought so. But there's just one problem with your plan," I said, reaching for my phone. "What's that?" I scrolled to the photo that had started this whole conversation. Marcus Taylor, very much alive, holding a recent newspaper. "You made one crucial mistake." Linda looked at the photo, and I watched all the color drain from her face. "That's impossible." "Marcus isn't dead, Maggie. And neither are Robert Harrison's children, or Michael Chin's wife, or Thomas Wright's brother. They've all been looking for you, and now they found you." The cafe door opened, and Agent Chin walked in, followed by Agent Torres and 2 other men in suits. Linda's head snapped toward them, and I saw the exact moment she realized what was happening. "You," she hissed, starting to stand. "I wouldn't," I said calmly. "There are agents at every exit." Linda sank back into her chair, her breathing rapid and shallow. "You're wearing a wire." "I am, and you just confessed to enough crimes to put you away for the rest of your life." Agent Chin approached our table, her badge visible. "Elizabeth Margaret Sawyer. You're under arrest for fraud, theft, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder." As they read her rights, Linda stared at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over." "Yes," I said, standing up as they cuffed her. "It is." But even as I watched them lead her away, I knew the hard part was just beginning. I still had to face George, still had to tell David the truth about his wife, still had to figure out what was left of my own life after everything that had happened. The game was over, but the real work of rebuilding was just about to start. 6 months after Linda's arrest, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The space was smaller than the house George and I had shared, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every coffee mug chosen by me for me. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago. George had tried to fight it at first, begging me to consider counseling, promising he'd change, swearing that what happened with Linda was an aberration that would never happen again. But I was done with his promises, done with his excuses, done with a marriage that had been built on my willingness to look the other way while he did whatever he pleased. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from David. "Coffee this afternoon, I have news." I smiled, typing back, "My place or yours, yours. I like what you've done with it." My relationship with my son had been the one bright spot in this whole nightmare. When the truth about Linda came out, not just her real identity, But her plans for his father and his business, David had been devastated. But instead of blaming me for keeping secrets, he'd thanked me for protecting him. I should have seen it, he'd said during one of our long conversations in the weeks following Linda's arrest. There were things that didn't add up, but I wanted to believe I'd found someone who loved me. That's not a character flaw, sweetheart. I told him that's being human. She was very good at what she did. Now, 6 months later, David was healing. He'd thrown himself into his work, expanded his business, even started dating again carefully but with hope. He was stronger than I'd given him credit for. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 years. David stood on my doorstep with a bouquet of sunflowers and a grin that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been. "You look happy," he said, kissing my cheek as he handed me the flowers. "I am happy." I realized, surprised by how true that statement was. Really, genuinely happy. We settled on my small balcony with coffee and the blueberry scones I'd learned to make in the cooking class I'd joined last month. Another new thing, another piece of the life I was building for myself. "So, what's this news?" I asked. "Marcus Taylor called me yesterday." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Marcus? Why?" "He wanted to thank me. Apparently, the FBI was able to recover about 60% of the money Linda stole from him using information from her arrest. He's getting his house back. That's wonderful, but that's not the best part. He's starting a support group for people who've been victims of romance scams. He asked if I wanted to help." I sat down my cup, studying my son's face. "And do you?" "I think I do. It feels like something positive could come out of all this mess, you know? Maybe we can help other people avoid what we went through, or at least help them recover from it." I reached across the small table and squeezed his hand. "I think that's a beautiful idea." "Ah, what about you, Mom? What are you going to do with your new life?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. For 42 years, my identity had been wrapped up in being George's wife, David's mother, the keeper of a household that ran smoothly because I made sure it did. Now at 63, I was free to be whoever I wanted to be. "I'm thinking about going back to school," I said, finishing that degree I never completed when I got married. "Really? What would you study? Criminal justice, maybe? Or psychology?" After everything that happened with Linda, I keep thinking about how easy it was for her to manipulate people, how she read everyone's weaknesses so accurately. I'd like to understand that better. David raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I agreed, clinking my cup against his. Later that evening, after David had left, I found myself looking through the photo albums I'd rescued from the house. Pictures of our family over the years, holidays, birthdays, graduations. In so many of them, I could see what I'd missed at the time. George's distance, his distraction, the way he always seemed to be looking somewhere else, even when he was smiling for the camera. But there were other photos too. Pictures of David and me, moments when it was just the two of us. His high school graduation where George had been unavoidably detained at work. The day David got his business license when George had forgotten to show up entirely. In those photos, I could see something I'd forgotten. I'd been a good mother. Despite everything else that had gone wrong, I'd raised a kind, honest, hardworking man. That was worth something. That was worth a lot. My laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was someone I didn't recognize. Jennifer Walsh, Mrs. Henderson. The email began. "I hope you don't mind me contacting you. Agent Chen gave me your information. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I was married to Thomas Wright, one of the men your daughter-in-law defrauded. I wanted to thank you for your courage in exposing her." I continued reading, my chest tightening with each word. Tom Henderson died believing he was a failure, that he'd destroyed our family's future through his poor decisions. He never knew that Linda Parker, was a professional criminal who had done the same thing to many other people. Because of your bravery, I've been able to recover some of our money. But more importantly, I've been able to tell our children the truth about what happened to their father. He wasn't a fool. He was a victim. That knowledge has lifted a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying. The email went on to explain that several of Linda's other victims' families were planning to attend her sentencing hearing the following month. They wanted to make sure the judge understood the full scope of the damage she'd caused. "Would you consider writing a victim impact statement?" Jennifer Walsh asked. "I know you weren't directly swindled out of money like the rest of us, but she destroyed your family too. Your voice matters." I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about victim impact statements and justice and the strange turns life can take. A year ago, I'd been a woman who avoided conflict, who preferred to handle problems quietly, privately. Now, I was being asked to stand up in a courtroom and speak publicly about the most painful period of my life. A year ago, the thought would have terrified me. Now it felt like an opportunity. I started typing my response. 3 weeks later, I stood outside the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, wearing the navy blue suit I'd bought for my divorce proceedings. Agent Chen met me at the entrance. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, "As ready as I'll ever be." The courtroom was packed. I recognized some faces from the photos James had shown me months earlier. Marcus Lee, now looking healthier and more at peace. Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair. Several other people who I assumed were family members of Linda's victims. Linda sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back severely. No trace of the polished woman who'd once sat at my dinner table. She'd aged years in the months since her arrest. When she saw me enter the courtroom, her expression hardened, but she didn't look away. One by one, her victims and their families took the stand to speak about the damage she'd caused. Marcus Lee spoke about the 3 years he'd spent believing his wife was dead, the depression that had nearly driven him to suicide. Jennifer Walsh read a letter her youngest daughter had written about losing their family home. A man named Robert Harrison Jr. spoke about his father's final months. Consumed with shame and self-loathing when my name was called, I walked to the witness stand on steady legs. I'd practiced my statement dozens of times, but as I looked out at the courtroom, I set my prepared remarks aside. "Your Honor," I began. 6 months ago, I thought I knew who I was. I was a wife, a mother, a woman who kept her family together by keeping the peace. I thought my job was to smooth over problems, to look the other way when things got difficult, to protect everyone else's feelings, even when it meant sacrificing my own well-being. I glanced at Linda Parker, who was staring at me intently. The defendant taught me something valuable, though I doubt she intended to. She taught me that being quiet in the face of evil isn't kindness, it's cowardice. She taught me that protecting people from the consequences of their actions doesn't help them. It enables them. And she taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to tell the truth, even when it's painful. I paused, gathering my thoughts. The defendant didn't just steal money from her victims. She stole their sense of reality, their ability to trust their own judgment, their faith in other people. She made them doubt everything they thought they knew about love, about family, about themselves. That kind of damage doesn't show up on a bank statement, but it's real and it's devastating. I looked directly at Linda Parker now. But here's what she didn't count on. Some of us are stronger than we look. Some of us refuse to let her define our stories. Some of us take the pieces she left behind and build something better. When I finished speaking, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone quietly crying. I returned to my seat, my heart pounding, but my conscience clear. The judge sentenced Linda Parker to 15 years in federal prison. As the bailiff led her away, she turned to look at me one last time. I met her gaze steadily, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Defeat. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer Walsh approached me. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "Thank you," I replied, "for helping me understand that I wasn't alone in this." That evening, I called David Henderson to tell him about the sentencing. Then I called my sister in Los Angeles, California, whom I hadn't spoken to in years because Harold Henderson had always found excuses for why we couldn't visit. I made plans to see her next month. Then I opened my laptop and began working on my application to the local community college. It was time to finish what I'd started 40 years ago. As I worked, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago. Afraid to rock the boat, willing to accept scraps of affection, convinced that keeping everyone else happy was more important than my own well-being. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. I thought about Harold, too. Alone in the house that felt too big for one person, probably wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Part of me felt sorry for him, but a larger part of me felt grateful. If he hadn't betrayed me, if Esme hadn't forced my hand, I might have spent the rest of my life sleepwalking through a marriage that had died years ago. The sunrise would come again tomorrow, painting my little kitchen in shades of possibility. And for the first time in decades, I would be awake to see it fully present in my own life, ready for whatever came next. At 63, I was finally free, and I intended to make the most of every day I had left. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.